Hi, so this is the second video I'm doing on the book Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft. And here in this section, Peter Kreeft basically goes into depth on what inductive reasoning is and deductive reasoning is, and the criteria for proper deductive reasoning. So let's get into it. What is inductive reasoning? Inductive reasoning is, as Kreeft says, reasoning from a particular premise to a general or universal conclusion. And this yields probability. So if you don't know what a premise is a proposition that leads to or moves to another proposition, which is usually the conclusion. There can be multiple premises and there can be multiple conclusions, but an example is, and then especially for inductive reasoning, an example is what? Um, well, for inductive reasoning, I haven't read of any examples yet. I could make up one, but I would rather not give a bad example. And for deductive reasoning, it's reasoning from a general or universal premise to a particular conclusion, and this yields certainty. So deductive reasoning, this is the very famous, it has a very famous example. It is was Socrates, all men are mortal. Socrates, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And it starts off by the universal premise that all men are mortal, and it finally reaches the conclusion that Socrates is immortal from that using that general premise. So, inductive reasoning from a particular premise to a general or universal conclusion. Deductive reasoning from a universal premise to a particular conclusion. Inductive only yields probability. It might be true, most likely is, but deductive reasoning always holds certainty because this general or universal premise is true for in every way. It has to be true because everyone or anything in that subject is literally it basically has to be true. It's a general universal principle. And criteria for proper deductive reasoning. There's three criteria for proper deductive reasoning. And firstly, unambiguous and clear terms. You have to define these terms properly. And if you don't know what a term is a subject or predicate of the proposition. And it has to be either clear or unclear. Otherwise, two people could be arguing and they could be holding to different terms. They could be holding to different interpretations of terms in a syllogism or how do you say in a proposition. And it'll cause confusion. They'll never work it out. They'll think the other person is always wrong when they're not agreeing on the same idea and they're disagreeing. And they don't understand each other's arguments basically with unclear terms. And you could actually see this historically through what? Um, Historically, you can see this through, how do you say, the Christian philosophers, usually those, not philosophers, really the theologians in the past, they have confused, especially the East to West. Eastern churches and Western churches sometimes misinterpreted each other, leading to accusing one or another of heresy. Usually, it was a good example is the Portuguese when Portuguese propaganda and the Portuguese Padroado when they came to India and they read through the Syro-Malabar Christians' texts. And the Syro-Malabar Christians, they had their own theology. It was quite for they've been there for hundreds of years, since what around 300 if you hold to the St. Thomas migration theory since the first century. Anyways, these Portuguese people they read the theology manuscripts or whatever of the Syro-Malabar Christians, and they're like, wait a minute, this is all heresy. This is wrong. And they basically burnt like a ton of their texts. And the remnants or only remnants or basically the contents, how we know these texts or the contents of these texts is only the majority is from these Portuguese historians and these theologians who wrote about them. And I think even a Dominican, even several theologians back then said there was not a fair assessment of the theology. Dr. Placid Podiparo, who was a famous Syro-Malabar theologian and historian, he wrote that there was not a fair assessment. Well, that's an example of unambiguous and clear terms. What happens is you have two people disagreeing, thinking they have no idea what each other's argument actually is because the terms aren't clear at all. Each person is holding to different interpretations of like a word. And the second one is true premises. You need a true premise for your deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning again, general or universal premise. You can't make up a premise and then somehow get to a conclusion. If that were the case, you could literally make up anything. That's what Kreeft says. False premises can be used to justify almost everything. But no, these true premises have to correspond to reality. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. Lastly, logically valid. Basically, the conclusion must logically follow the premise. So if the premise is true, the conclusion is also true. That's a pretty easy one. And I could define, what a term is. As I said, it's a subject or predicate in a proposition. It is either clear or unclear. And propositions are always declarative sentences. Propositions are either true or false, and they are either corresponding to reality or the opposite. Hence, there has to be true premises. Otherwise, if there's false premises, if they do not correspond to reality, I don't think the conclusion will be exactly true. And what is this? A valid and invalid argument. Basically, how do you say it? Uh, Infallibility and hold it, pardon me. I'm just reading a few of my notes here. Okay. This is what Kreeft is saying. Basically, the validity and invalidity of an argument is distinguished by using laws of logic. Anyways, that wasn't really an important one. And what is this? Deductive arguments, logically valid arguments, basically is there's various forms of argumentation, each with inherent rules for validity, and these are natural to themselves and to the human mind. So there's various forms of argumentation, each with their own inherent rules for validity, and they're natural to ourselves. By common sense, we understand they're true. And yeah, that's basically it. Just a short section on, logic and some, basic criteria for some basic things. But Kreeft says these things are essential to understanding anything else in his book and in general for the traditional logic. You have to understand these basic things. What is a term? Propositions, whether they're always true or false, valid and invalid arguments. You need to use logic to, understand them, X, Y, Z. Anyways, thank you.